Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast. This week on PA Books, Robert Strauss, author of John Marshall, the Final Founder.
Robert Strauss is the author of John Marshall, the Final Founder. You say in the book that John Marshall may well have been the Zelig of the founding era. Who was Zelig and why was Marshall like him?
Okay, well, Zelig was a character in a Woody Allen movie, and you can compare him to Forrest Gump too. He just was everywhere. Zelig was this character that any photo you'd ever see of historic note he was in. So that's how Marshall was. I mean, Marshall lasted a long time. For those who don't know who Marshall was, he was the first significant Supreme Court Chief Justice. That was what he was known for. But starting with Valley Forge, where he was, till 1835, when he died here in Philadelphia, he had many different jobs in the federal government and the state governments. And what I like to point out is that it wasn't that hard to be a founding father, to tell you the truth. I know you revere all of these guys, and they were all men, of course, unless you count Abigail Adams, who's been pushed up lately. But the population of the United States, the first censuses were in 1790 and 1800, and the population in 1790, and this is significantly after the Declaration of Independence, was only 3.9 million. But half of those people were women. Many of them were slaves or black men who couldn't vote, so they couldn't hold office either. And then there were, of course, many children. People had a lot of children because there were a significant number who died. So you had maybe 600,000 white men over 21, if you want to count the 21 as the age he could have become a founder. So that's not really that many, 600,000. It's a third of Philadelphia, right? So that it's just not that many. And then you consider what the country was. If you look at those early censuses, in 1800 even, there are only 5 places in the United States that had more than 10,000 people. There was Philadelphia, New York, way above everybody else, at about 50,000. And then there was Baltimore, Boston, and Charleston, South Carolina. And every other place had less than 10,000 people. Now, we often view the colonial era, or whatever that you want to call it, or post-colonial era, as sort of a junior version of what we have now. But it wasn't so. People lived remotely. They wanted to. They came to America because it was wide open. There was expanses. You could have lots of land. John Marshall's father was a surveyor. He was a friend of George Washington. That's how they made their dough. I mean, you would go out as a surveyor. It wasn't like seeing where your sidewalk is in your suburban town. It was thousands of acres that somebody would be wanting to purchase. And what you probably got was a little piece of that, 100 acres. Now, 100 acres sounds like a lot. Well, it was a lot. This is what you wanted. You wanted land. You were in this country that land was the thing that you could have. You couldn't have it in the Netherlands, for God's sakes, or Great Britain. There just wasn't that much of an expanse. So America, it was like a land rush. It was like the gold rush of the 49ers, only it was a land rush in the colonial and post-colonial era here. So that's how these people came to rebel, because they just saw that we have this new thing. We're new kinds of people. Why did the American Revolution happen? Well, that's pretty much why it happened. The people coming over from Britain were the old people. We're the new people. And they were able to form this government. And John Marshall was one of those people who did. He was the one who made the court system what we have today.
Well, let's go back to Marshall's beginning. Where did he grow up?
He grew up in what then was thought of as Western Virginia, but now it's about where Winchester or something like 50, 70 miles out of what Washington, D.C. is now, but of course wasn't then. And that was a distance. It took a while to get there. We didn't have cars or anything. It took a while to get those 50 or 70 miles away because there were no roads per se. You knew your way, much like your own personal GPS. His father, like I said, he was a friend of Washington, so he came of age just as the war was starting, just as the Revolutionary War was starting, and his father trained him in these sort of whatever you want to call them, military arts, because of course they hadn't fought anywhere. And when it came time to muster up, Marshall and his father went to this place by their house, and Marshall just called himself a lieutenant. He had like 12 friends, and so he was the head of a brigade. There was no such thing. They didn't fight any wars. I mean, yes, they fought in the French and Indian War, some of them, but those are mostly British soldiers. Mostly the Americans who came to settle did not fight in it. Washington was unusual in that. So they went off to see, the senior marshal's friend, Washington. They went up to New Jersey. They got to fight in 1776, 1777. They came to Valley Forge. And the Valley Forge, one of the things about Valley Forge is it's not in a valley. Why would Washington, this great general, put his troops in the winter in a valley so he couldn't see what was going on if the British in Philadelphia were going to come out? So Valley Forge is really on a hill. Yes, there's little streams running through it, but in any case, it's up on this hill, and they started to. We have this vision of Valley Forge as a place where people were going around with paper shoes and dying, dropping off and dying at once. Well, it wasn't wonderful. Don't get me wrong, but there were 12,000 soldiers there. If that many died, we wouldn't have had much of a war, would we? So most of the people who died of if you go out to Valley Forge now, you can see the huts that they built. Now, like I said, it wasn't wonderful. It was cold, but most of the people who died in Valley Forge died of disease and died later in the winter or early spring, because those rivulets that came through there were filled of excrement, for instance. People did come through Valley Forge and were selling. Well, they wanted to sell stuff. They were farmers out in that neck of the woods, and there was meat to eat and so forth. But anyway, what Marshall came in Valley Forge is he was a jock. He was an athlete. He only went to 1 year of school. Can you imagine this guy who becomes the Supreme Court Chief Justice now? 8 of the 9 of them went to Harvard or Yale, either law school or undergrad now. But he went to 1 year. His father sent him off to some boarding school at about 10, where he met James Monroe, another famous Virginian. And that was it. He studied mostly at home. There were books in the house. But he studied, he became an athlete. And when he got to Valley Forge, what he took upon himself is he had games for the soldiers and to keep their spirits up. And he was known, like I say, as a jock. He was the Bruce Jenner or O.J. Simpson of Valley Forge. He was the rec director, and one of the diaries has one of the soldiers saying that he could jump over a rod or some sort of stick that was held on the heads of 2 soldiers. So that's pretty good, 6-7 feet, right? I mean, that's not quite Olympic standards, but pretty good. And so that's how he kept and then he kept a good relationship with Washington. He was really Washington's greatest acolyte. I know if you saw Hamilton, you saw Alexander Hamilton is a great courier of favor with Washington, but he does fall out with him at some point. But Marshall always sort of stuck with Washington as his supreme being, so to speak.
So I want to go back to his childhood a little bit and talk about his education. You mentioned that he had limited formal schooling. What would he have been reading in his father's library? You mentioned in the book Alexander Pope was a significant figure at the time.
Alexander Pope was the Danielle Steele of early America. For whatever reason, Pope's books of Pope were in most libraries, such as they were. I mean, nobody had a library Thomas Jefferson had a great library, but most people did not. And of the few books they would have, and of course they have the Bible. They're mostly Christians, and that would be in most people's houses. So those would be the two great books. And so they would memorize things. It wouldn't be like they'd read it once. It'd be like memorizing, whatever poems you had to memorize in school. And then they would have other English authors, such as they were, either famous or not famous.
Did his family own slaves?
His family did not, but he did later. So his family was. His family was quite big in of itself. He was the first of 10 children, and so the elder Marshall was not that rich to have slaves.
How old was John Marshall when the Revolution began?
He was born in, I believe, 1757. So he was a late teenager when he went to those camps, like I was telling you, and as we know, many of them were supervised by state officials, and Patrick Henry was the governor, and so he would authorize whatever troops would become and whatever battalions were there. It was pretty loosey-goosey. I mean, if anything you read about the Revolution, one of Washington's greatest things is that he kept the war going. He was a great retreater. He had a vision that the British would get tired of the war if he could just keep the troops there. So a lot of the scenes that you see or histories that you read will show Washington in battle, not the same way you would imagine him running over people and somebody throwing a hatchet at somebody's head or whatever it is. It was mostly a series of leading the British around as far as he could.
Now, in addition to Valley Forge, Marshall also served at a couple other battles or a couple other sites in Pennsylvania. One was the Battle of Brandywine. What happened there?
It was another one of those strategic go in there, do some damage and run away. I mean, as you know, after Brandywine it was when and Germantown, those battles right around Philadelphia, that the British retreated into Philadelphia. The British, while the American troops were in Valley Forge, the British were doing it up in Philadelphia. It was a great party town that winter. The playhouses were open. The restaurants were open. The hotels were open. It was the big city, and it's curious in a certain sense that the war wasn't over then, but it wasn't. The Congress escaped to various parts of Pennsylvania to meet. When they did, they didn't meet much in the winter, of course. And that was a serious time. We could have lost. The British could have squelched anything, but they didn't. For some reason, they just holed up in Philadelphia instead of attacking in Valley Forge.
Now, you quote one historian as saying that Valley Forge was a better training for Marshall's peculiar abilities than Oxford or Cambridge could have been. Why?
Well, because he learned about being a military person. I mean, we had oddments of European military people, von Steuben and so forth, and Kosciuszko, people who had been in wars in Europe, were able to at least train as they would. I mean, von Steuben put people through drills, whatever they were, got them together. It was more. I mean, the war, at least at that point, was more an idea of togetherness. That you were serving a purpose. You were there. Some of them were there to be gallant, and others were there because it was a job. But many of them were there because they found this collegial element that they didn't find in their far off branches in the various parts of the country.
How long did Marshall serve in the Army? When did he leave?
Just a couple of years. I don't know. I don't know whether he was conscripted and his time was up after in the year after Valley Forge, but what happened was his father got a little military job. I guess Washington probably got it for him over in the Yorktown, Williamsburg area of Virginia. Now, one thing I want to tell you about our country is that at that point, Virginia was by far the largest state. Now, I don't mean an area, although it was quite large in area, but it had 21% of the population of the United States. Now, many of them were slaves, but still, 21%. Can you imagine that now? So we went from a Virginia-centric country to later on in the 19th and early 20th century to a New York-centric country, and now we're probably a California-centric country. But it's hard to remember that we had all the famous people Madison, Monroe, Jefferson, Washington, Patrick Henry, and Marshall. For those of you who know him, these were all Virginians. It said that when the committee met to write the Declaration of Independence, Adams said to Jefferson that you're writing it because nobody will follow it unless a Virginian had a big part of it. Virginia was this mega place.
Now, John Marshall, of course, we know him, as you mentioned earlier, as a Supreme Court justice. What kind of legal training did he have?
He had limited legal training. This is what happened. So he goes to visit his father when his time is over. He goes down to Yorktown, and in Yorktown there hadn't been a lot of partying going on. A lot of the men left to serve in the military, and there was this one family, the Amblins, who had 3 teenage daughters, sort of like the story in Hamilton. They weren't the Schuylers; they were the Amblin girls, and. Joaquin Amblin was a person of note. He ended up marrying the former paramour of Thomas Jefferson. So Jefferson didn't like the Amblins to begin with. He was Marshall's second cousin. He was governor of Virginia at this time, but later on he had a great enmity for Marshall, and you can get into that later. Anyway, like I say, he didn't like the Amblins, but the Amblin girls decided they heard this war hero was going to come, so they're going to have a party. And we know this mostly from the oldest daughter's diaries. But so John Marshall comes to this great party, and suddenly he's not like Christopher Reeve in Superman. He's wearing a fringed a jacket, much like John Voight wore in Midnight Cowboy. He's wearing a tilted hat because that's the hat he wore when he was a soldier. He's sort of gangly. He's very polite, but he doesn't have like refined manners. But before he came there, the 13-year-old Amblin girl said, "I'm going to get him," and sure enough, she does. And Marshall, who is in his early 20s, is smitten with her. So he says, "I'm staying around." And at William and Mary College, the second oldest college in the country, there was a man named George Wythe, who everybody studied with, who wanted to really learn the law. He was the, I don't know, I guess the top law professor, such as they were in the United States. So Marshall goes over and he talks to Professor With, and he joins his class. Well, in Marshall's papers, and all these people had voluminous papers, Washington, Jefferson, Adams, they must have known that they were doing something that people would want to read about later. Anyway, in Marshall's papers, his notes for this law class that he's taken with Professor With are filled with little notes on the side, but they're notes like Polly Amblin and John Marshall, J.M. and P.A. You know, it was like he was a middle school girl of the 20th or 21st century. He's writing little notes about her. He's over there every night. He's over their house. He's studying the law with Professor With, but in any case, the elder Amblin gets a job in Richmond, so they're going off to Richmond, and once again, remember the girl's 13 years old, and in any case, Marshall decides, my work's done here. He takes off. He writes to Jefferson. He gets his law license, and he gets to Richmond. So he studied about 5 or 6 weeks of the law. 1 year of school at 10, 5 or 6 weeks of the law. This was his entire education.
Was it unusual for a 20-something man to have a relationship with a 13 or 14-year-old girl?
Well, apparently not among our founding fathers. When John Adams started dating Abigail Adams, she was 15. And he was in his early 20s. Marquis de Lafayette, I agree, he was French, but he married his wife at 14. Now, he was an older teenager, but still older. And of course, Jefferson started dating, or whatever you want to call it, with his slave mistress when she was 14, and he was even older. He was in his 30s.
So once Marshall gets to Richmond, did he start a law practice there? Did he become involved in politics?
Yeah, he gets involved in politics. Now, you got to remember that the thing about time and space in that time, it is pretty amazing. I mean, Richmond today is, you know, you go across the state on the interstate from Yorktown or Williamsburg, and you're there an hour and a half, 2 hours. Well, it took 2 days to get to Richmond. Even though there was actually a road. So he gets there and he starts a law practice, as you might. And in time, he gets on this committee or that committee through the House of Burgesses, and he becomes what some people think is the best lawyer in Richmond. Well, big deal. There were 2,700 people there. You know, I mean, it's not an insignificant achievement, but it's not like what you would think today. And he continues onward in Richmond, and he finds, like I say, he's on this or that and the other job. Eventually, gets elected to Congress, and following his mentor Washington.
Was he associated with any particular faction?
Yeah, of course, he was a Federalist. Now, you know, of course, Washington did not want any parties. He didn't feel this was necessary. He had, he had in his cabinet. His cabinet was only 4 people, and one of them was Jefferson, and one of them was Hamilton. They were diametrically opposed in their ideas of what the country should be. Eventually, that broke into the Federalist and Democrat-Republican parties, and Marshall was a definite Federalist. He wanted to see a strong central government, a bank, all the states cleaving to the federal government. Now, one of the things that happened, of course, is the Constitutional Convention in Philly in the summer of 1787, and they come up with this great document in 4 months. Can you believe it? I mean, it takes 4 months to get a bridge named after somebody in Congress today. So, but one of the things in the Constitution is that they said this is valid when 9 states ratify it. Well, 9 states ratify it, and left over is North Carolina, Rhode Island, New York, and Virginia. Well, good luck having a country without New York and Virginia. I mean, they were the two largest states. So 9 really didn't mean much. Yeah, it was a legitimate thing once New Hampshire signed it. But Marshall decides to take on Patrick Henry, who was the greatest orator of his generation, and he was the governor. Well, he wasn't the current governor of Virginia, but he was a well-known and well-respected person there, and he wanted no parts of this Constitution. So they debate, and there are other people in the debate, of course, but Marshall starts to stand out, and the people who like the Constitution, I don't mean bow to him, but put him up front, and he convinces the assembled people there to ratify the Constitution, but not by much. It was 10 votes out of about 140. So you see how close we came to not having a country. Now, even after Virginia ratifies it, and New York, in waiting for Virginia, ratifies it. Now we have a country. But like I said, if Virginia decided to go the other way, I don't know exactly what would have happened. We would have maybe had the country of Virginia, or maybe North Carolina becomes part of that. We have a South and a North. We have a New England Confederation. Maybe we have a bigger thing where there's a military treaty. But it was really close.
Now, you mentioned that when he was in Richmond, he started a club, and I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this right, but was it Quoits?
Quoits. I don't know how many of you. I know when I was a little boy, I had a Quoits set, and mine were like rubber rings, and they went. It was a horseshoe-like game. It had to go on a post. It was another way that he could satisfy his jockdom, although obviously it was not a thing of. They had to have a great breath to do. So one of the things that Marshall was a great party giver. I guess I write about great party givers because I wrote about James Buchanan before, and he was a wonderful party giver. And Marshall was looked upon as a fun guy. I mean, that's basically what he was, and he developed all these relationships, and that's how he got ahead in his business. And his business was politics or the law. So this Quoits Club is the club he has. Richmond is not much of a city, as I've said. Where the state legislature met could have been like a Costco warehouse. It was like this, barely a building, and across the street was the town government in a slightly better building. But in the middle was no road. There were no paved roads in the state capital of Virginia, the state capital of our largest state. And once again, there's one of these little rivulets through the middle with waste, and you have to jump over it to get into the state capital. We somehow view ourselves or those times as a junior version of what we have now, but not so. These were places that were small, they were intimate. A town of 2,700. I don't know where anybody out there lives, but if you live in a town of 2,700, you know everybody. And even if you lived in Philadelphia, which had 40-some thousand people, it's interesting about that. I was telling you about that 1800 census and the 5 large cities. Number 6 and number 7 were Southwark and Northern Liberties, and for those who live around Philadelphia, they are now part of the city. But they were separate parts of the city then. Southwark was several blocks below Independence Hall, and Northern Liberties was several blocks above, and so even then. Philadelphia, even if you counted those two, Philadelphia had maybe 50,000 people. So even a town of 50,000 people, you know a lot of them, and that's how the country existed.
Now, given Marshall's relationship with Washington and his role advocating for the Federalist cause, did Washington try to get him to join his administration at any time?
Yes, he did. He gave him a couple of offers: Attorney General, U.S. Attorney for Virginia, things like that. But somehow Marshall said, I don't know, it doesn't seem like it's that much better than what I have. For instance, this was not a uncommon position. John Jay was the first Supreme Court Chief Justice, and he quit to become governor of New York. Now, you see how far that's gotten people. But in any case, he thought governor of New York was better. The second, John Rutledge, quit to become a high court judge in South Carolina. So, some of these federal jobs just didn't appeal to a lot of people. It was a hard life. You would have to uproot yourself and go to Philadelphia or New York when it was the capital, or even later in Washington. It wasn't easy to get there. They didn't have, helicopters and planes and cars and trains to get you back home. So he waited it out. He went a diplomatic mission to France, called that was later named the XYZ Affair, where he came home a hero. Finally, John Adams, who he became good friends with, was also a Federalist, appointed him Secretary of State. This happened because Adams found that several of his cabinet members were secretly aligned with Hamilton and trying to subvert him. So later in his presidency, he appoints Marshall Secretary of State. Now, it's not quite the job as it is now. Yes, it did deal with foreign governments, but mostly it was like a chief of staff, and it was a great bureaucracy. He had 6 employees as Secretary of State, and one of the things that he did is that Adams was a great. He didn't stay in Philadelphia that much, or even Washington when it became the capital during his administration. One year of his 4-year term, he spent 7 months at home in Quincy, Massachusetts. Now, we sit here and complain about Barack Obama's and Donald Trump's golf games and George Bush going off to chop wood in his farm in Texas, but that's nothing. He later on, he did not like the heat and sweltering humidity of Washington as it's being built. And he decides to go home. And he points to Marshall and he says, "It's yours now, build it." So Marshall was also the sort of the general contractor of early Washington. And you could make a case that he might have been the first person to sleep in the White House because he was there supervising the building of it, and it had to be. It was with the White House, this is a beautiful building, probably much better than his room in the hostel across the street.
Now, while he was serving as Secretary of State, Adams was also going to appoint him to the Supreme Court. How did that come about?
Okay, so for anybody who knows about the election of 1800, it was a bizarre election. We think of several of our modern elections, the last two, the Gore-Bush election, but this was really bizarre because the Constitution at that point did not delineate the vice presidential electoral votes. The vice president that ran with the president got the same number of electoral votes as the president did. So at the end of this 1800 election, where the Democrat-Republicans clearly won, Burr and Jefferson had the same number of electoral votes, and Burr decides he's going to challenge it. He's going to decide how to become president. Well, there's a standoff, constant standoff. It goes to the House of Representatives. Each state gets 1 vote. Some people are proposed as temporary presidents, Marshall being one of them, but they continue onward. And at this point in our country's history, March 4th was the inauguration date, not January 20th, but it goes till February. And finally, the representative from Delaware relents, goes to Democrat Republicans because they semi-bribe him. They say his father-in-law can have a judgeship. And this is how Jefferson becomes president. So now it's late. So it's late now in the term of Adams. And in the winter, the then current, the third Supreme Court Chief Justice, Oliver Ellsworth, he's been sent off to do a mission in Paris to settle the disputes about the Barbary pirates. Well, he's stuck there. Now, first of all, just think about this. The Supreme Court Chief Justice is sent to Paris to do a diplomatic mission. It's as if Biden calls in John Roberts and says, we got some trouble in Afghanistan. Would you go over there and settle it? That sort of thing. So we did not have this great separation of powers that we think about in those days. John Jay also, while he was Supreme Court Chief Justice, was sent to England to do a peace treaty. So anyway, Ellsworth couldn't get back. First of all, he was sick, and second of all, it was the last ship out of France for the winter. So he sends a note and says, "I'm not coming back. You got to get a new guy." And Marshall, as Secretary of State, goes in and tries to advise Adams about who he might pick. And Adams says, "No, I think it'll be you." And what happens then, of course, he becomes Supreme Court Chief Justice while he's still Secretary of State. Once again, two jobs that you can't imagine one person having. But part of this is that the Federalists are losing. The Federalists at this point have the presidency and both houses of Congress. Well, it's going to turn on March 4th. Jefferson wins, and Congress is going to turn Democrat-Republican. So what happens is this Federalist Congress passes a law and gets dozens of new judgeships to be filled with Federalists. Now, we think here, depending on which side you're on, that the Supreme Court now is 6-3 conservatives to liberals. Well, just imagine that Jefferson takes office with every single federal judicial employee being a Federalist, being of the other party. Every one, whatever it is to nothing. So this is how Marshall's term starts.
Now, one of the big cases that would come out of this situation was Marbury versus Madison. What happened there?
Okay, well, you have to have the perspective of the federal judiciary was thought of as not much. When they build the Capitol, the Congress gives them a basement office to meet in. That office on many Saturdays holds dances. Not many places to hold dances in Washington, D.C. at that point. It was certainly not nice rooms like that, even if they're in the basement. Many Sundays it has a church service, and then the Supreme Court meets there. Now, the Supreme Court has 6 people. Why Congress gave them 6 people instead of an odd number, who knows? But they do. But once again, not thought as much. The first term of the Supreme Court, there was one case that came up, and that was settled out of court too. So essentially, no cases in the first session. Now they had 2 sessions a year. They weren't tremendously long sessions, but they were sessions of these people coming in from all parts of the country. Marshall decides he's going to change all of that. He's going to make the judiciary into something. He's going to Washington makes up all the rules about what's going to be the presidency. I don't mean he sits there and thinks of them as rules, but he doesn't dress up in kingly garb. He doesn't anoint his stepson to be the next president. He decides on 2 terms. He has meetings of a cabinet. He goes out in public. It's what the presidency becomes because Washington is the man that took upon himself. He's the first president. Well, Marshall decides he's going to do the same thing with the judiciary. And so there's these. So let me back up now about why this Marbury versus Madison. Okay, so there's a guy named Bill Marbury. He is sort of an operator. He's a guy who always gets little jobs that the Federalists appoint him to. One of those jobs was was a justice of the peace in Washington, D.C. Now, this is happening in this last month of the Adams presidency, that he's one of those people. And but Marshall, as Secretary of State, has to sign off on all of these things. And several of these commissions don't get delivered quite on time before March 4th, before the government turns and James Madison becomes Secretary of State. So Marbury doesn't get his. So he sues. He doesn't sue. He takes to court Madison to, give me my commission. I was appointed. I've got to have. I want it, and I think you should give it to me. So Marshall decides to take on this case. Now, in the meantime, the Jeffersonians are trying to thwart all these judiciary appointments. They delay the next meeting of the Supreme Court for a couple of years, 19 months. But Marshall has it in his mind that he's going to take on this case. And as you know, many of the cases of the Supreme Court, or even Supreme Courts of states, are not so much about the facts, but about the theory that you can get behind this case. And this is what Marbury versus Madison becomes. So it does finally get to be heard. Now, what's interesting about this is Marshall liked all of his Supreme Court under justices to stay in one place. So there was a collegiality. There was an idea that as one, they would be more forceful, especially in these early times when nobody thought they would be. And Marshall also, even beyond this, liked to have the case not be unanimous, but be by consensus. In other words, it might be 4-2 in the voting, but we're going to speak as one voice. You're going to win sometimes, and you're going to win some other times, but we're going to always speak as one voice. And Marshall wrote many of his opinions. He wrote about 500 of the 1,000 cases that he heard, the Supreme Court heard in his time. In any case, one of the Supreme Court justices has gout, and he can't make it over to the Capitol. So Marshall decides, well, he can get downstairs in the hotel, and we're going to decide this case. We're going to hear the case in the lobby of the hotel. So Marbury versus Madison is perhaps the most significant case in Supreme Court history. It's heard in the lobby of a sort of a ramshackle hotel. Marshall comes down with this opinion. One of the things about Marshall's opinions is he always gives the other side a little sop, and then he spouts off about the theory of the case. Well, in this case, he says that Madison has a perfect right not to give Marbury his commission. It didn't come to him in time. It's not his fault. He's the Secretary of State. He's the boss. He can give the commission or not. But he comes up with a theory that that the Supreme Court can only have power, what they call judicial review. It can review it's there to review a case that's heard either Congress and a person, the administration and a person, two states, a state and anyway, there are certain 5 or 6 different kinds of cases they can hear, and one of them is a case between an individual and the federal government. But he said, and in this case, the Judiciary Act of 1789, which I won't get into the complications of it, but it was an early Judiciary Act, is invalid because it would give the the Supreme Court too much power, and therefore it is not a part of the. It runs afoul of the Constitution, so the big thing about this is that the Supreme Court can review a case. This is not in any other judicial system. No democracy, no monarchy, not England, not France, no progressive places, not the Netherlands, not Sweden. This is the first time a thing called judicial review becomes the case. And this is what separates the Supreme Court of the United States from every other high court.
Now, one of the questions you ask in the book is, when did the founding end? What did you conclude?
Well, when the founding, well, in my book I do have a bunch of little essays like that. And when did the founding end? You can say, is it the Declaration of Independence? Is it the Constitution? One fellow, James Traub, who wrote a great biography of John Quincy Adams, says it's when the Adams presidency is over. That's the end of where the founders. He counts Quincy Adams as a founder because of his father. And then there's one of the people I interview say, "Is it over yet?" And but I picked Marbury versus Madison because that's when finally the three parts of the government are co-equal.
Now, you also mentioned in the book that at 71, Marshall was reading Jane Austen's novels.
Yeah, he was a great reader, as you see. I mean, he wasn't formally schooled very much, but he decided, he would decide to just read whatever came by him, whatever came through Richmond, I'm sure, whatever came through Washington, and he had time to do it. When he was on the road, they had what they call ride circuits. So each Supreme Court justice had cases to be heard in the capitals of the states that they were assigned. He would bring books with him.
Now, you say that later in the 19th century there was a Supreme Court justice who was named after Marshall, John Marshall Harlan. Who was he? Yeah,
John Marshall Harlan. There's a new biography of him. He was in the Harlans were prominent people in Kentucky. They were slaveholders during. They were Unionists, though. They stayed with in the Civil War, stayed with the Union, but they were slaveholders. They had to get rid of their slaves after the Emancipation Proclamation. But eventually, as prescribed by Harlan's father naming him, John Marshall Harlan becomes a great lawyer and a Supreme Court justice. In the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, in the late 19th century, that's where the term "separate but equal" came. So it essentially validated the Jim Crow laws, because the southern states, or even northern states, could provide two different venues for black and white people, and they were claimed to be equal. Well, there's certain things that probably were equal about them, that they had a building and a toilet, but there was nothing that was equal for blacks in that case. And John Marshall Harlan wrote The Great Dissent. It was an 8-1 decision. And one of the things that he said, which is interesting and maybe valid today, is that he admitted that he once had these other opinions, but he said great people can, or even simple people can change their mind, and I'd rather be right now than have a legacy. And so he wrote this Great Dissent saying, black people are people, and they deserve not separate, but to basically join in the society. And his dissent was the basis for the case of Brown versus Board of Education much later in the 20th century, which well, I now say supposedly, but knocked down the idea of separate but equal.
Now, in the book, you also write about your own education and why you decided to study philosophy. What drew you to that topic?
Okay, well, I always loved. My father had a great. He was a great reader of American history, mostly. Sometimes history of religion, but American history. And I lived outside of Philadelphia, and we always, dragged me into Philadelphia many times. Washington. In New York, we went to, had to read every signpost, what it said, and made sure I read it out loud so he could hear it. Not so that he could hear, but so that he could hear that I did it. And we had many fun incidences doing this. I was an only child, so so I was one dragged. and he was an early helicopter parent, and he had decided where I was going to go to college, and I decided that I wasn't going to do that, and I applied to a good school in Minnesota, Carleton College. It was the greatest thing I ever did. I went away from Philadelphia to Minnesota, and then it's a small liberal arts college, much like in the Philadelphia area, Haverford or Swarthmore, and I had to decide what I was going to major in, and I knew I would read history and English anyway, and I decided, unlike most people who I guess these days decide how it's going to get you a job, I decided to major in philosophy because I knew if I didn't read it now, I was never going to read it. So that's how I majored in philosophy. It was a good basis to become a sports writer, which is what I became right after school.
Can you talk a little bit about John Marshall's relationship with Joseph Story?
Yeah, here's the thing. Lots of people like to have mentees, the other way around. And when, as you may imagine, the Federalists did never held power again. So for those 35 years of Marshall being on the Supreme Court, the people who came in were always Democrat Republicans, or later Jeffersonians, Jacksonians. Anyway, that the party that became the Democratic Party. So as the Federalist judges died or quit or whatever, they were always replaced by these people of the other party. But that didn't bother Marshall. Marshall viewed his job as forwarding the neo-federalist way of doing things. That the federal government was the most important. All of his major cases show that the federal government is where we should be looking for our judicial for our judicial ideas. So this fellow Joseph Story was a younger, of course, judge, and they just created a great friendship, even though their political philosophies were completely different. One of the great things that he did with Story, though, was that Marshall, as I told you, was a great partier, and one of the things that he said was that you could only drink when it was raining. So often he would send, it's in the middle of a case or whatever they were doing, or at the end of a case, and he would send a Story out to, would you go look at the weather? And he says, Mr. Chief Justice, it's a beautiful sunny day out. He says, well, it's raining somewhere, bring out the Madeira,
Who replaced John Marshall as Chief Justice?
Well, it's sort of a diametrically opposed guy. It was Roger Taney, who was a slaveholder from Maryland. His brother-in-law was Francis Scott Key, also a slaveholder from Maryland, much as we like to think of the land of the free and the home of the brave, and the Francis Scott Key national anthem wasn't quite so in his lifetime. Taney ended up writing the decision in the most likely worst case that ever became a part of the Supreme Court history, and that's the Dred Scott case, which essentially said that slavery could not be legislated out. It had to be a constitutional amendment because it was in the Constitution. It invalidated all the great compromises before that no doubt people read about in school. Missouri, 1820, Kansas-Nebraska Act. In any case, it was a heinous decision, caused the Great Depression of 1857 because people didn't know where slavery was going. It was quite precipitous and essentially led to the Civil War.
And we only have a few minutes left, but before we go, I just wanted to ask you about the biography of George Washington that Marshall wrote.
Yeah, there you go. So, when I wrote about James Buchanan, it was called Worst President Ever, it's not like everything that James Buchanan did was so heinous. Like I said, he was a great party giver. He was a great compromiser. People liked him, but he was a bad president. Well, same thing here. Marshall was a great, he had many great things about him. One of them was not writing a very good biography of George Washington. Washington's papers were left to him to write the official biography. A publishing house in Philadelphia started this idea of a subscription. They were going to have three different volumes. There were going to be a subscription service. People would pay a premium to have this subscription. And first thing Marshall does is he blows his first deadline. It takes him a couple of years longer. People start to want their money back. And then when the first volume comes out, there's nothing about George Washington in it. It's all about the prehistory of George Washington. That's not what people wanted. And it eventually wrote the succeeding volumes, which were very dry. You would not sit there and read them. And one of the salesmen of this set of biographies, a guy named Mason Weems, goes to the publishing company and says, I can do something better. And so what Mason Weems does is he does all the myths that you know about. George Washington chopping down the cherry tree, his wooden teeth, his throwing the dollar across the Rappahannock River. He never says it's a biography. He says it's a different form, some fiction, some facts, some myth, and he sells 50,000 copies. So there you go.
Well, we've been speaking with Robert Strauss. He is the author of John Marshall, the Final Founder. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, I thank you for having me here.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details.